When they called me too old for social media at 62, I thought my career was over. They said my content was outdated, my approach was antiquated, and I should step aside for the younger generation. But what they didn't know was that I had been quietly documenting everything. Every meeting, every dismissive comment, every illegal practice they thought I was too naive to understand. When I finally went public with what I had discovered, their billion-dollar empire crumbled in 48 hours. And suddenly, everyone wanted to know how the old lady had outsmarted the tech giants. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Margaret Chen, and until 6 months ago, I was the Senior Content Strategy Director at Nexus Digital, one of the fastest-growing social media marketing agencies on the West Coast. I had built my career over 25 years, transitioning from traditional advertising to digital marketing as the industry evolved. I was proud of my adaptability, my willingness to learn new platforms, and my ability to create campaigns that resonated across generations. The first sign of trouble came during our quarterly review meeting in March. I had just finished presenting the results of our latest campaign for a major retail client, which had exceeded all projected metrics by 30%. The engagement rates were through the roof, the conversion numbers were stellar, and the client had already signed a contract extension. I expected congratulations, maybe even a bonus discussion. Instead, I was met with uncomfortable silence around the conference table. Brandon Wells, our 28-year-old CEO, leaned back in his chair with that practiced, casual arrogance that seemed to be standard issue for tech entrepreneurs. His co-founder, Jessica Park, sat beside him scrolling through her phone as if my presentation was background noise. "The numbers are good, Margaret," Brandon finally said, his tone suggesting good numbers were somehow a problem. "But we need to talk about your approach. The content feels very, well, millennial-focused. Our clients are looking for something more authentic, more Gen Z." I felt my stomach tighten. I had been hearing variations of this criticism for months, always couched in business terminology that made it sound like legitimate feedback rather than what it really was. The client specifically requested content that would appeal to their primary demographic, which skews older. The campaign was targeted exactly as they asked. Jessica looked up from her phone for the first time during the meeting. "That's kind of the problem, though. You're thinking in terms of demographics instead of authentic engagement. Today's consumers can smell that corporate approach from a mile away." The irony was breathtaking. Jessica, who had never worked anywhere except tech startups, and whose idea of authentic engagement was hiring influencers to pretend they used products they'd never heard of, was lecturing me about corporate approaches. "I've been studying the analytics from our recent campaigns," I said, pulling up another slide. "The content I've been creating actually has higher engagement rates across all age groups compared to our competitors. The authentic approach you're talking about works well for lifestyle brands, but our clients need measurable ROI." Brandon and Jessica exchanged a look that I was becoming familiar with. It was the look that said, "We're dealing with someone who just doesn't get it, someone who's stuck in the past and can't evolve with the industry." "Margaret," Brandon said, leaning forward with the kind of forced patience usually reserved for explaining things to children, "we appreciate everything you've contributed to Nexus Digital. Your experience is valuable, but we're at a point where we need to pivot our strategy toward more innovative approaches." The word innovative was starting to make my skin crawl. In my experience, when people in tech said innovative, they usually meant untested, expensive, and designed more to impress other people in tech than to actually solve problems. Over the following weeks, I began to notice subtle changes in my role. Meetings that I had previously led were suddenly being handled by younger team members. Clients who had specifically requested to work with me were being reassigned to other account managers. My input was still solicited, but always with the caveat that we needed to make sure the content was relevant for today's market. The breaking point came in early May during our monthly all-hands meeting. Brandon stood at the front of our open concept office, his presentation screen displaying the kind of buzzword-heavy slides that had become standard at Nexus Digital. He talked about disruption and authenticity and the need to stay ahead of the curve in an evolving landscape. Which brings me to an exciting announcement, he said, his voice taking on the tone of someone about to reveal something wonderful. We're restructuring our content team to better align with our core values and target demographics. Jessica will be taking over as head of content strategy, bringing her fresh perspective and deep understanding of contemporary digital culture. I felt the room shift around me. Several of my colleagues glanced in my direction with expressions ranging from sympathy to curiosity about how I would react. Jessica smiled from her position near the front of the room, nodding graciously as if she was accepting an award rather than taking over the department I had built from the ground up. Now, this doesn't mean we don't value experience, Brandon continued, and I knew he was about to address my situation directly. Margaret will be transitioning to a senior advisory role, where she can share her knowledge with our younger team members and help ensure we maintain the institutional wisdom that has gotten us this far. Senior advisory role. It sounded impressive until you realized it was corporate speak for being pushed aside without being officially demoted. I would keep my salary, at least for now, but I would no longer have any real authority or influence over the direction of the company I had helped build. After the meeting, I sat at my desk, staring at my computer screen, trying to process what had just happened. 25 years of experience, countless successful campaigns, relationships with major clients who trusted my judgment, all of it apparently less valuable than Jessica's ability to understand TikTok trends. That evening, I went home to my apartment in Pacific Heights and poured myself a glass of wine that I definitely didn't taste. I had worked late nights and weekends to help Nexus Digital grow from a small startup to a company worth $40 million. I had sacrificed time with friends and family, turned down job offers from competitors, and believed that loyalty and results would be rewarded with job security. I was wrong. The next morning, I arrived at the office to find that my computer access had been restricted. I could still log in, but I no longer had access to client files, campaign data, or strategic planning documents. When I asked our IT manager about it, he looked uncomfortable and mumbled something about security protocols and need-to-know basis. Jessica appeared at my desk around 10 a.m. carrying a coffee and wearing the kind of smile that people use when they're about to deliver bad news but want to seem sympathetic. "Hey, Margaret," she said, perching on the edge of my desk in a way that immediately established who was now in charge. "I wanted to talk to you about your new role and how we can best utilize your expertise." I looked up at her, this woman who was 15 years younger than me and had never managed a team larger than 3 people, and waited for her to explain how she planned to utilize my expertise. "Brandon and I have been talking, and we think it would be great if you could focus on mentoring some of our junior team members. Help them understand the fundamentals of content strategy, the basics of client relations, that kind of foundational stuff." Foundational stuff? As if everything I knew about marketing and consumer psychology was elementary knowledge that could be passed along to recent college graduates in a few training sessions. "I also think it would be valuable for you to research emerging trends," she continued. "You know, keep an eye on what the younger demographics are responding to. Help us stay current with social media evolution." The absurdity of the situation was staggering. They were asking me to research trends on platforms that they claimed I didn't understand, to mentor young employees in skills they said were outdated, all while being excluded from the actual decision-making processes that would determine how that knowledge was applied. But I nodded and smiled because at 62, finding a new job in tech marketing would be nearly impossible. I had a mortgage, retirement savings that weren't quite where they needed to be, and no desire to start over in a different industry. What Jessica and Brandon didn't know was that I had been in this industry long enough to recognize patterns.
I had seen companies make similar mistakes before, and I knew how to pay attention to details that younger, more impulsive leaders often overlooked. Over the next several weeks, as I was marginalized in my own department, I began to notice things, small things at first. Budget discrepancies that didn't quite add up, client meetings that were happening without proper documentation, promises being made to clients that didn't align with our actual capabilities or capacity. I started keeping notes, not with any particular plan in mind, but because my instincts told me that something was off about the way Nexus Digital was being run. Brandon and Jessica were moving fast, making bold promises and signing contracts without the kind of due diligence that had always been standard practice. During my third week in my new advisory role, I was asked to attend a client meeting with Hartwell Industries, a manufacturing company that was looking to launch their first major social media campaign. It was exactly the kind of project I had handled dozens of times before, requiring a careful balance of brand positioning, audience analysis, and realistic timeline management. Jessica led the meeting with the confidence of someone who had never failed at anything important. She promised Hartwell Industries a complete social media transformation in 6 weeks, guaranteed viral content, and engagement rates that I knew were impossible to predict, let alone guarantee. "We're talking about a completely authentic approach," she told the Hartwell team, using that authentic word again like it was some kind of magical incantation. "We'll create content that doesn't feel like advertising because it will be genuinely connected to your brand values and your customers' lifestyle aspirations." The Hartwell executives nodded along, clearly impressed by Jessica's energy and confidence. When they asked about specific metrics and timeline details, she deflected smoothly, talking about the importance of organic growth and authentic engagement that couldn't be rushed or forced. After the meeting, I pulled her aside in the hallway. "Those engagement rate guarantees you made, they're not realistic for a manufacturing company with no existing social media presence." She waved off my concern with the kind of dismissive gesture I was becoming accustomed to. "Margaret, you're thinking too traditionally. With the right content strategy and authentic storytelling, any brand can achieve viral engagement."
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
But what happens when we don't deliver those numbers? Hartwell is paying us $200,000 for this campaign. "We'll deliver," she said firmly. "You just have to trust the process." That phrase, "trust the process," became Jessica's response to any concerns or questions about the increasingly ambitious promises being made to clients. When I pointed out that our team was already stretched thin and couldn't realistically handle the workload they were committing to, trust the process. When I noted that some of the newer employees didn't have enough experience to manage major client accounts independently, trust the process. The process, as far as I could tell, involved promising impossible results, charging premium prices, and hoping that somehow everything would work out. By June, I was essentially a ghost in my own office. I showed up every day, sat at my desk, attended meetings where my input was politely ignored, and watched as the company I had helped build began to unravel in ways that were invisible to everyone except me. The first major problem surfaced with the Hartwell campaign. After 4 weeks of content creation and social media posting, their engagement rates were nowhere near the guaranteed levels. Worse, some of the content that Jessica's team had created was generating negative responses from Hartwell's existing customer base, who felt that the new social media presence was inauthentic and pandering. When the Hartwell executives requested a meeting to discuss the underperforming campaign, Jessica blamed the results on algorithm changes and market saturation, suggesting that they needed to increase their budget to achieve the promised results. I watched this meeting from the back of the conference room, taking notes on my laptop and feeling a familiar sense of dread. I had seen this pattern before in other companies, the cycle of overpromising, under-delivering, and then asking for more money to fix problems that were caused by unrealistic expectations in the first place. But what happened next surprised even me. Instead of accepting Jessica's explanation or demanding better results,
The Hartwell team requested to speak with someone from senior management who could provide a more detailed analysis of what had gone wrong. Brandon, who had been notably absent from client meetings lately, reluctantly agreed to join the discussion. But instead of taking responsibility for the failed campaign, he did something that made my blood run cold. "I think part of the issue here," he said, glancing in my direction, "is that our initial strategy was influenced by some outdated approaches. We've since restructured our team to focus on more contemporary methods, but there may have been some legacy thinking that impacted the early stages of your campaign." Legacy thinking? He was blaming me for a campaign that I had been excluded from, using my age and experience as a scapegoat for Jessica's failures. The Hartwell executives looked confused, clearly not understanding the internal politics of what they were witnessing. But I understood perfectly. Brandon and Jessica were preparing to throw me under the bus for problems that were entirely their creation. That night, I went home and opened a new document on my personal laptop. I began transcribing the notes I had been taking over the past several weeks, organizing them by date and client. What I saw when I laid it all out was a pattern of systematic mismanagement, inflated promises, and financial irregularities that went far beyond simple incompetence. Nexus Digital wasn't just failing to deliver on its promises to clients, it was engaging in fraudulent billing practices, misrepresenting its capabilities, and operating in ways that violated several industry regulations and ethical standards. I had stumbled onto something much bigger than age discrimination. I had discovered evidence of a company that was systematically defrauding its clients while using employees like me as convenient scapegoats when their schemes inevitably fell apart. The question was, what to do with this information? I was 62 years old, already marginalized at work, and facing the very real possibility that I would be fired and blamed for problems I had tried to prevent. Going public with what I had discovered would almost certainly end my career at Nexus Digital and possibly make it impossible for me to find work anywhere else in the industry. But as I sat in my apartment that evening, looking out at the San Francisco Bay and thinking about the clients who were being deceived and the younger employees who were being set up to take the fall for their leaders' mistakes, I realized that staying silent wasn't really an option. I had spent my entire career building relationships based on trust and delivering results that clients could count on. Everything that Brandon and Jessica were doing violated those principles, and if I didn't speak up, I would be complicit in their fraud. The next morning, I arrived at the office early and began systematically documenting everything I had observed. I made copies of emails, saved screenshots of internal communications, and compiled a comprehensive record of the discrepancies between what Nexus Digital promised clients and what it actually delivered. What I found was worse than I had initially realized. Not only were Brandon and Jessica systematically overcharging clients for services that were never delivered, but they were also manipulating data to hide their failures. Engagement rates were being artificially inflated in reports, campaign metrics were being misrepresented, and client feedback was being suppressed or ignored entirely. More disturbing was what I discovered about the company's hiring practices. Brandon and Jessica had been specifically targeting older employees for removal, using performance reviews and restructuring announcements to push out anyone over 50. I wasn't the only experienced professional who had been marginalized and scapegoated for their leaders' mistakes. There were at least 6 other employees who had been forced out over the past year, all of them replaced by younger workers who were paid significantly less and had far less experience. The pattern was clear and illegal. Nexus Digital was engaging in systematic age discrimination while simultaneously defrauding its clients. Brandon and Jessica had built their company's growth on the backs of experienced professionals, then discarded those same people when they became inconvenient or expensive. By the end of July, I had compiled over 200 pages of documentation, internal emails, client communications, financial records, and performance data that painted a comprehensive picture of a company engaged in widespread fraud and discrimination. I knew that going public with this information would be risky. Brandon and Jessica had money, legal resources, and connections throughout the tech industry. I was a single employee with no powerful allies and a career that was already in jeopardy.
But I also knew that what they were doing was wrong, and that if I didn't act, they would continue to harm clients and employees with impunity. The final straw came in early August when Jessica announced that I was being transitioned out of my advisory role entirely. The company was restructuring again, she explained, and they no longer needed senior advisory positions. "We really appreciate everything you've contributed to Nexus Digital," she said during what was clearly a termination meeting disguised as a career transition discussion. "But we think it's time for you to explore new opportunities that might be a better fit for your background and experience level." My background and experience level. Another euphemism for too old. "We're prepared to offer a generous severance package," Brandon added, sliding a folder across the conference room table. 6 months of salary, continued health benefits, and a positive reference for any future job applications. I opened the folder and scanned the severance agreement. It was generous, at least compared to what most employees received when they were fired, but buried in the legal language was a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement that would prevent me from discussing anything about my time at Nexus Digital, including any concerns I might have about company practices or client relations. They were paying me to stay silent about what I had discovered. "I'll need some time to review this," I said, closing the folder without signing anything. "Of course," Jessica said with false warmth. "Take all the time you need. Just keep in mind that this offer expires at the end of the week." That evening, I sat in my apartment with the severance agreement on one side of my kitchen table and my compiled evidence on the other side. 6 months of salary would provide a financial cushion while I looked for new work. The non-disclosure agreement would ensure that I could leave Nexus Digital without making any enemies in the industry. But staying silent would also mean that Brandon and Jessica would continue defrauding clients and discriminating against older employees. Other people would lose their jobs, other clients would lose their money, and the cycle would continue until someone else finally had the courage to speak up. I thought about my career, about the principles that had guided me for 25 years, about the relationships I had built with clients who trusted me to tell them the truth even when it wasn't what they wanted to hear. Then I thought about my daughter, Emma, who worked as a journalist for a tech industry publication in New York. Emma was 34, brilliant, and had been writing about issues of workplace discrimination and corporate fraud for years. She would understand what I was facing, and she would know how to help me get the story out in a way that couldn't be suppressed or discredited. I picked up my phone and dialed Emma's number. "Mom," she answered on the second ring, sounding surprised to hear from me on a weeknight. "Emma, I need your help with something. I think I've discovered something important about my company, but I'm not sure how to proceed." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "What kind of something?" I took a deep breath and began to explain everything I had discovered about Nexus Digital. The fraud, the discrimination, the systematic deception of clients, and the attempt to silence me with a non-disclosure agreement. They were paying me to stay silent about what I had discovered. "What kind of something?" I took a deep breath and began to explain everything I had discovered about Nexus Digital. The fraud, the discrimination, the systematic deception of clients, and the attempt to silence me with a non-disclosure agreement. Emma listened without interrupting, asking only occasional clarifying questions. When I finished, she was quiet for several long moments. "Mom," she finally said, "what you're describing isn't just workplace discrimination. This is criminal fraud on a massive scale. If you have the evidence you say you have, this could bring down the entire company." "That's what I'm afraid of." "No," Emma said firmly, "that's what needs to happen. Companies like Nexus Digital get away with this because people are afraid to speak up. You have the evidence and the knowledge to stop them." "But I'm 62 years old, Emma."
Mom, you've been in this industry for 25 years. You have a reputation that goes far beyond one company. And honestly, if this industry doesn't want people like you, people with integrity and experience, then maybe it's an industry that needs to change. Emma was right, of course. I had been so focused on preserving what was left of my career that I had lost sight of what really mattered. The truth mattered. Justice mattered. The principle that companies shouldn't be able to defraud clients and discriminate against employees just because they could afford lawyers and had connections in the industry. What do I need to do? I asked. First, don't sign that non-disclosure agreement. Second, make sure all your evidence is properly backed up and secured. Third, let me make some calls. I know people who specialize in this kind of investigation, and I know publications that won't be intimidated by tech industry pressure. Over the next 3 days, Emma worked her network of contacts while I continued gathering evidence. She connected me with employment lawyers who specialized in age discrimination cases, investigative journalists who covered corporate fraud, and former employees of other companies who had faced similar retaliation for whistleblowing. What I learned was both encouraging and terrifying. Encouraging because I wasn't alone, and there were legal protections and professional networks designed to support people in situations like mine. Terrifying because the scope of corporate fraud and discrimination in the tech industry was far larger than I had realized. Nexus Digital wasn't an isolated case. It was part of a pattern of companies that prioritized rapid growth and short-term profits over ethical business practices and employee welfare. On Friday morning, the day my severance offer was set to expire, I walked into Brandon's office and placed the unsigned agreement on his desk. "I've decided not to accept the severance package," I said. He looked up from his laptop with an expression of genuine surprise. "Margaret, I hope you're not making this decision based on pride. This is a very generous offer, and it would provide you with financial security while you transition to the next phase of your career." "I'm making this decision based on principle," I said. "I can't accept money to stay silent about practices that are harmful to clients and employees." Brandon's expression shifted from surprise to concern. "I'm not sure what you think you've observed, but I want to assure you that Nexus Digital operates with complete integrity and transparency." "Then you won't mind if I discuss my observations publicly?" The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Brandon closed his laptop and leaned back in his chair, studying me with the kind of calculating look that I had learned to recognize over the past several months. "Margaret, I think you need to be very careful about making accusations that you can't substantiate. The tech industry is a small community, and reputations can be damaged very quickly." It was a threat, politely delivered but unmistakable in its intent. He was warning me that speaking out would result in retaliation that would extend far beyond Nexus Digital. "My reputation is based on 25 years of honest work and successful client relationships," I said. "I'm not worried about protecting it by telling the truth." I left his office and went directly to my desk where I began the process of copying the last of my evidence files to a secure external drive. By lunchtime, I had everything I needed to build a comprehensive case against Nexus Digital. That afternoon, Emma called to tell me that she had arranged meetings with 3 different investigative journalists, 2 employment lawyers, and a contact at the Federal Trade Commission who specialized in consumer fraud cases. "Are you ready for this, Mom?" she asked. "Once we start this process, there's no going back. They're going to fight you with everything they have." I looked around the office where I had spent the last 3 years of my career, at the younger employees who were working frantically to meet impossible deadlines, at the conference room where Brandon and Jessica were probably planning their next round of overpromises to unsuspecting clients. "I'm ready," I said. That weekend, I met with Emma and her contacts in a conference room at a law office in downtown San Francisco. I spent 8 hours walking through my evidence, explaining the patterns I had observed, and answering detailed questions about Nexus Digital's operations and client relationships. The lawyers were impressed by the thoroughness of my documentation. The journalists were excited about the scope of the story.
The FTC contact was interested in the consumer fraud implications, but everyone agreed that going public would require careful coordination and legal protection. Nexus Digital had resources and would almost certainly attempt to discredit me personally and professionally. "The key," explained Sarah Martinez, one of the employment lawyers, "is to control the narrative from the beginning. We need to present your evidence in a way that focuses on the systematic nature of their fraud and discrimination, not on your personal grievances as a terminated employee. Over the next 2 weeks, we prepared a comprehensive legal filing and media strategy. The employment lawyers filed age discrimination complaints with both state and federal agencies. The FTC contact initiated a preliminary investigation into Nexus Digital's billing and advertising practices. The journalists began reaching out to other former employees and current clients to verify and expand on my evidence. Meanwhile, I continued going to work every day as if nothing had changed. Brandon and Jessica were clearly uncomfortable with my decision to decline the severance package, but they hadn't yet moved to terminate me outright. I suspect they were hoping I would eventually change my mind and sign the non-disclosure agreement. They had no idea what was about to hit them. The story broke on a Tuesday morning in late August. Emma had coordinated with her contacts to ensure that the investigation appeared simultaneously in 3 major publications: TechCrunch, the San Francisco Chronicle, and Forbes. The headlines were devastating. Major marketing agency accused of systematic client fraud and age discrimination. Inside the Nexus Digital scandal, how a tech startup built success on lies. 62-year-old whistleblower exposes Silicon Valley age bias and consumer fraud. The articles were comprehensive, well-researched, and damning. They included not only my evidence, but additional testimony from other former employees, documented complaints from clients, and analysis from industry experts who confirmed that Nexus Digital's practices violated both employment law and consumer protection regulations. Within hours of the article's publication, my phone started ringing with calls from reporters, lawyers, and other employees who wanted to share their own experiences with workplace discrimination in the tech industry. By noon, Nexus Digital's website had crashed from the volume of traffic, and their social media accounts were flooded with comments from angry clients and supportive messages from people who had faced similar treatment at other companies. Brandon and Jessica attempted damage control, releasing a statement that denied all allegations and threatened legal action against anyone spreading false information about the company. But their response only made things worse, as it was quickly pointed out that threatening sources and journalists was exactly the kind of intimidation tactic that my story had warned about. By the end of the week, 3 major clients had terminated their contracts with Nexus Digital. The company's investors had called an emergency board meeting, and the California Attorney General's office had announced a formal investigation into their business practices. The personal cost was significant. I received threatening emails, nasty comments on social media, and at least one attempt by someone associated with Nexus Digital to hack into my personal accounts. But I also received hundreds of supportive messages from people who shared their own stories of age discrimination, workplace retaliation, and corporate fraud. Most importantly, I heard from other older workers in the tech industry who said my story had given them the courage to speak up about their own experiences with discrimination and marginalization. 2 months after the story broke, Nexus Digital filed for bankruptcy. Brandon and Jessica were facing multiple criminal investigations and had been forced to step down from their leadership roles. The company's assets were being liquidated to compensate clients who had been defrauded, and several other employees had come forward with their own discrimination complaints. I never worked for another marketing agency, but I didn't need to. The publicity from my whistleblowing had generated dozens of opportunities for consulting, speaking engagements, and advocacy work. Companies that wanted to improve their workplace culture and avoid discrimination lawsuits were eager to hire someone who understood both the practical and legal aspects of creating inclusive environments. More importantly, I had discovered something I hadn't expected when I first decided to speak out against Nexus Digital. I had found my voice again. Not just as a marketing professional, but as someone who could make a real difference in an industry that desperately needed to change.
The tech industry's obsession with youth and disruption had created a culture where experience was undervalued and wisdom was dismissed as irrelevance. But the Nexus Digital scandal had shown that this culture came with real costs, not just for older workers who were pushed aside, but for clients who were defrauded and for the industry's long-term health and credibility. 6 months later, I was invited to speak at a major tech conference about workplace diversity and ethical business practices. Standing on that stage, looking out at an audience of industry leaders and young entrepreneurs, I realized that being called too old for social media had been the beginning of something much more important than my career. It had been the beginning of a movement to hold tech companies accountable for their treatment of employees and clients and to prove that experience and integrity were not outdated values in a rapidly changing industry. When they called me too old for social media, they thought they were ending my story. Instead, they had given me the most important chapter of my career. And I was just getting started. The morning after my conversation with Emma felt different somehow, as if the world had shifted slightly on its axis while I slept. I woke up with a sense of purpose that I hadn't experienced in months, but also with the weight of what I was about to undertake pressing down on my chest like a physical presence. I made my coffee and sat at my kitchen table with my laptop, staring at the folder labeled Nexus Evidence that I had created the night before. Inside were screenshots, email chains, financial documents, and meeting notes that painted a picture of systematic fraud and discrimination. But looking at it in the cold light of morning, I wondered if it would be enough to convince anyone that a respected tech company was engaged in criminal behavior.
The first thing I needed to do was expand my documentation beyond what I had already gathered. If I was going to make accusations this serious, I needed evidence that was comprehensive, verifiable, and legally sound. Emma had stressed that point during our phone call. Accusations without bulletproof evidence would be dismissed as the complaints of a disgruntled former employee. I started by creating a detailed timeline of everything that had happened since the quarterly review meeting in March. Every conversation with Brandon or Jessica, every meeting I had been excluded from, every change in my responsibilities or access to information. The pattern that emerged was even more disturbing than I had initially realized. The marginalization had been systematic and deliberate. Within 2 weeks of my successful campaign presentation, my computer access had been quietly restricted. Client meetings that I had been managing for months were reassigned to junior staff members without explanation. My input on strategic decisions was solicited, but then ignored in favor of approaches that directly contradicted industry best practices. But the timeline also revealed something else. The changes in my role had coincided exactly with Nexus Digital's pivot toward what Brandon and Jessica called disruptive marketing strategies. These strategies, as far as I could determine, involved making increasingly bold promises to clients while cutting costs by replacing experienced staff with recent graduates who would work for significantly lower salaries. I spent the next several days conducting what I privately called reconnaissance missions within my own office. I arrived early, stayed late, and paid attention to conversations and meetings that I was no longer invited to participate in. What I discovered was a company in crisis that was desperately trying to maintain the appearance of success. The Hartwell Industries disaster was just the tip of the iceberg. 3 other major clients were experiencing similar problems with campaigns that had promised viral success but delivered embarrassing failures. Global Tech Solutions, a software company that had paid Nexus Digital $300,000 for a comprehensive social media overhaul, was threatening legal action after their new branding campaign generated widespread mockery on Twitter and LinkedIn. Meridian Financial Services had terminated their contract after discovering that the influencer partnerships they had paid for were actually relationships with fake accounts that had purchased their followers.
The influencers Jessica's team had contracted with were posting content about financial services they clearly knew nothing about, creating liability issues that Meridian's legal team was still trying to resolve. Most disturbing was what I learned about Coastal Hospitality Group, a boutique hotel chain that had hired Nexus Digital to help them recover from pandemic-related revenue losses. Jessica had promised them a complete digital transformation that would position them as the premier destination for conscious travelers seeking authentic experiences. The campaign had been running for 3 months and had not only failed to increase bookings, but had actually driven away existing customers. The social media content was generic and tone-deaf, featuring stock photography that bore no resemblance to the actual hotel properties. The influencer partnerships promoted activities and amenities that didn't exist at the hotels, leading to negative reviews from disappointed guests who had booked based on false advertising. Coastal Hospitality was not just threatening to terminate their contract, they were considering a lawsuit for breach of contract and false advertising. Their legal team had already sent a formal demand letter requesting a full refund of the $250,000 they had paid for the campaign, plus damages related to lost bookings and reputation harm. But instead of acknowledging these failures and working to correct them, Brandon and Jessica were doubling down on their approach. During a staff meeting that I observed from the back of the room, Jessica announced that they were expanding their influencer partnership program and hiring additional junior staff to handle the increased workload. "We're seeing tremendous growth in demand for our services," she said, addressing the room with the kind of confident energy that had initially impressed me when she first joined Nexus Digital. "The market is responding to our authentic approach, and we need to scale our operations to meet client expectations." The disconnect between Jessica's public statements and the reality of what was happening with clients was staggering. Either she was delusional about the company's performance, or she was deliberately misrepresenting the situation to maintain staff morale and investor confidence. I suspected it was the latter. During my investigation, I had discovered that Nexus Digital was in the middle of a funding round, seeking additional investment to support their rapid expansion. Potential investors were being shown carefully curated performance metrics that painted a picture of explosive growth and client satisfaction. What those metrics didn't show was the high rate of contract terminations, the legal threats from dissatisfied clients, and the fact that much of the reported growth was coming from short-term projects that were canceled before completion. The company was creating an illusion of success that would collapse as soon as investors or clients looked closely at the actual results. My breakthrough came during my second week of intensive documentation gathering session. I was working late one evening, long after most of the staff had gone home, when I noticed that Jessica's office light was still on. She was on a phone call, speaking in a voice that was much more tense and urgent than her usual confident public persona. I couldn't hear the entire conversation from my desk, but I caught enough fragments to understand that she was discussing the Coastal Hospitality situation with someone who was clearly not happy about the legal threats. The words settlement and non-disclosure came up repeatedly, along with references to other clients who had apparently been handled similarly. After Jessica finished her call and left the office, I waited 20 minutes to make sure she was really gone, then made my way to her office. The door was locked, but I had learned during my years in corporate environments that most office locks were more about privacy than security. Jessica's desk was covered in documents related to the various client crises that Nexus Digital was managing. Contract termination notices, legal correspondence, and what appeared to be settlement agreements with clients who had agreed to keep quiet about their negative experiences in exchange for partial refunds. But the most revealing document was a spreadsheet that appeared to track what Jessica was calling reputation management costs. It showed payments to former clients, legal fees for various disputes, and projected expenses for settling additional complaints.
The total amount was over $2 million, money that was being categorized in the company's books as marketing expenses and client retention costs. Nexus Digital wasn't just failing to deliver on its promises to clients, it was systematically covering up those failures through financial settlements that were hidden from investors, staff, and the media. The company's apparent success was built on hush money and legal intimidation.
I photographed every document I could find, being careful to capture not just the content, but also the headers and formatting that would prove their authenticity. By the time I left the office that night, I had evidence of a cover-up that went far beyond simple business incompetence. The next morning, I called Emma to update her on what I had discovered. Her response was immediate and unequivocal. "Mom, what you found isn't just employment discrimination. This is securities fraud. If they're misrepresenting their financial performance to investors while using settlement money to hide their failures, that's criminal behavior." What does that mean for me? It means you're not just a whistleblower reporting workplace problems. You're potentially a key witness in a federal criminal case. You need legal protection, and you need it immediately. Emma arranged for me to meet with a criminal defense attorney who specialized in white-collar crime cases. Daniel Rodriguez had spent 15 years as a federal prosecutor before entering private practice, and he had handled several high-profile corporate fraud cases in the tech industry. "The evidence you've gathered is compelling," he told me during our initial consultation, "but building a criminal case requires more than documentation. We need to establish intent to deceive, pattern of behavior, and quantifiable harm to victims." Over the following weeks, Rodriguez helped me organize my evidence in a way that would be useful for federal investigators. We created detailed timelines, financial analyses, and witness statements that painted a comprehensive picture of Nexus Digital's fraudulent practices. But he also warned me about the personal risks I would face by coming forward. Companies like Nexus Digital have significant resources and will use them aggressively to discredit whistleblowers, he explained. They'll investigate your personal finances, your professional history, your family relationships. They'll look for anything they can use to undermine your credibility. Are you trying to talk me out of this? I'm trying to make sure you understand what you're getting into. This isn't just about filing a complaint and moving on with your life. This will become your life for the next several years. Every decision you've ever made, every mistake you've ever made, will be scrutinized by teams of lawyers and private investigators. The weight of his words was sobering. I had been thinking about exposing Nexus Digital as a way to seek justice for their treatment of me and their deception of clients. I hadn't fully considered that doing so would essentially put my entire life under a microscope. But as I thought about the clients who were being defrauded, the employees who were being scapegoated, and the investors who were being lied to, I realized that my personal comfort was less important than stopping a criminal enterprise. "I understand the risks," I told Rodriguez. "What do we need to do?" The first step was to secure all of my evidence in a way that would protect it from tampering or destruction. Rodriguez arranged for me to store copies of everything with a third-party legal service that specialized in whistleblower protection. This would ensure that even if Nexus Digital somehow discovered my investigation and tried to destroy evidence, the documentation would be preserved. The second step was to identify other potential witnesses who could corroborate my observations. This was more challenging than I had expected. Most of the employees who had been pushed out of Nexus Digital had signed non-disclosure agreements as part of their severance packages. Even those who were willing to speak privately were reluctant to go public with their experiences. But Rodriguez had contacts throughout the legal community who were able to identify former Nexus Digital clients who had been harmed by the company's practices. Many of these clients had signed settlement agreements with confidentiality clauses, but Rodriguez explained that these agreements couldn't prevent them from cooperating with criminal investigations. The breakthrough came when we connected with Patricia Williams, the former marketing director at Coastal Hospitality Group. Patricia had been fired from her position after the Nexus Digital campaign failed, despite the fact that the problems were entirely due to the agency's incompetence rather than any failings on her part. "I've been trying to find a way to hold them accountable for months," she told me during our first phone conversation. "They destroyed my reputation in the hospitality industry and cost me a job I loved. But when we tried to pursue legal action, our lawyers said the settlement agreement made it too risky." Patricia had kept detailed records of her interactions with Nexus Digital, including email chains that showed Jessica making specific promises about campaign performance that she knew were impossible to deliver. More importantly, Patricia had recordings of phone conversations where Jessica admitted that the company's standard practice was to overpromise in order to win contracts, then manage client expectations downward after the money had been paid. "She told me directly that this was how all marketing agencies operated," Patricia explained. She said it was industry standard to set ambitious goals and then help clients understand why those goals weren't realistic once the campaign was underway. What Patricia described wasn't industry standard at all. It was fraud. Promising specific results that you know are impossible to achieve in order to secure payment is textbook criminal deception.
With Patricia's testimony and documentation, we now had evidence from both inside and outside Nexus Digital that the company was engaged in systematic fraud. But Rodriguez wanted more corroboration before we approached federal investigators. One client complaint could be dismissed as a business dispute, he explained. 2 complaints suggest a pattern. 3 or more complaints demonstrate systematic criminal behavior. Finding additional clients who were willing to come forward proved easier than expected. Word had apparently spread through industry networks about Nexus Digital's practices, and several companies had been quietly sharing information about their negative experiences. Marcus Thompson, the CEO of Global Tech Solutions, had been particularly frustrated by Nexus Digital's handling of his company's social media campaign. The campaign had promised to position Global Tech as an innovative leader in enterprise software solutions, but had instead generated widespread criticism for its tone-deaf messaging and obvious lack of understanding of the target market. They charged us $300,000 and delivered content that looked like it was created by someone who had never worked in the tech industry, Marcus told me during our phone conversation. When I complained, they blamed the poor performance on algorithm changes and market saturation. Then they had the nerve to suggest that we increase our budget to fix the problems they had created. Marcus had documentation showing that Nexus Digital had used the same generic content templates for Global Tech that they had used for completely unrelated industries. The social media posts promoting enterprise software solutions were nearly identical to posts they had created for a restaurant chain, with only the industry-specific terminology changed. This wasn't just incompetence, it was deliberate fraud. Nexus Digital was charging premium prices for customized marketing campaigns while delivering mass-produced content that showed no evidence of actual strategic thinking or industry knowledge. The third client who agreed to speak with us was Rebecca Martinez, the founder of Eco Living Products, a sustainable home goods company that had hired Nexus Digital to help them reach environmentally conscious consumers. Rebecca's experience was perhaps the most egregious of all. Nexus Digital had promised to connect eco-living products with influencers who were passionate about sustainability and environmental responsibility. Instead, they had partnered with lifestyle influencers who clearly knew nothing about environmental issues and were posting content that was often contradictory to eco-living's core values. One of their influencers posted a video promoting our bamboo kitchen products while simultaneously advertising fast fashion and disposable beauty products, Rebecca explained. Another influencer talked about our commitment to carbon neutrality while posting from a private jet. It was like they were deliberately trying to damage our brand. When Rebecca complained about these contradictions, Jessica had dismissed her concerns by explaining that modern consumers didn't pay attention to consistency across different posts. She suggested that Rebecca was being too rigid in her expectations and needed to trust the influencer marketing process. But the real scandal came when Rebecca discovered that several of the influencers Nexus Digital had contracted with were actually employees of the company posing as independent content creators. The authentic partnerships that she had paid for were fake relationships with fake influencers who were being paid directly by Nexus Digital to promote products they had never used. This wasn't just false advertising, it was wire fraud, using electronic communications to deceive clients for financial gain. By December, Rodriguez and I had compiled evidence from 6 different clients, all of whom had been systematically defrauded by Nexus Digital. The patterns were consistent across all cases: impossible promises made to win contracts, generic or inappropriate content delivered instead of the customized campaigns that have been sold, and aggressive attempts to silence complaints through legal intimidation and settlement agreements. But we also had evidence of the company's internal operations that showed the fraud was deliberate rather than accidental. Email chains between Brandon and Jessica discussing how to manage client expectations after overcommitting on deliverables. Budget documents that allocated money for settlement payments as a standard cost of doing business. Performance metrics that were deliberately manipulated to hide the company's true failure rate. Most damning was a recording that Patricia Williams had made of a phone conversation with Jessica, where Jessica explicitly stated that the company's business model was based on winning contracts with ambitious promises and then using legal agreements to prevent clients from seeking recourse when those promises weren't fulfilled. The key is to make sure the contracts are structured so that non-performance doesn't constitute breach. As long as we can demonstrate that we delivered some services, even if they weren't effective, we're protected legally. This was an admission of intentional fraud, captured on recording by someone who had been directly harmed by the company's practices.
Rodriguez felt we had enough evidence to approach federal investigators, but he recommended one additional step. Instead of going directly to the FBI or the Department of Justice, he suggested we first contact the Securities and Exchange Commission. Nexus Digital is actively seeking investment based on fraudulent financial representations, he explained. The SEC has jurisdiction over securities fraud, and they have resources specifically dedicated to investigating tech company fraud. They'll be able to move quickly on this case. The SEC meeting was scheduled for early January at their San Francisco field office.
Rodriguez and I spent several days preparing a comprehensive presentation that laid out the evidence in a clear, chronological format that would be easy for investigators to follow. But as the meeting date approached, I found myself struggling with anxiety and self-doubt. I was about to accuse my former employer of criminal behavior based on evidence that I had gathered through what could be characterized as corporate espionage. Even though I believed I was doing the right thing, I worried about how my actions would be perceived and what the consequences might be for my future. Emma called me the night before the SEC meeting to check on how I was feeling. "Are you having second thoughts?" she asked. "Not about whether they're guilty," I said, "but about whether I'm the right person to be doing this. I'm 62 years old, I've been pushed out of my job, and I'm about to make accusations that will destroy a company that a lot of people depend on for their livelihoods." "Mom, you're not destroying the company. The company destroyed itself through criminal behavior. You're just making sure that behavior has consequences." She was right, of course, but knowing that intellectually didn't make the emotional weight of what I was about to do any easier to bear. The SEC meeting took place in a sterile conference room that could have been in any government building anywhere in the country. Two investigators, Agent Sarah Chen and Agent Michael Foster, listened as Rodriguez and I presented our evidence over the course of 3 hours. Their questions were thorough and professional. They wanted to understand exactly how I had gathered the evidence, what my motivations were for coming forward, and whether I had any personal financial interest in Nexus Digital's failure. "We appreciate the thoroughness of your documentation," Agent Sen told me at the end of the presentation. "Cases like this often depend on witnesses who are willing to come forward with insider knowledge, but who also have credibility and clear motivations for seeking justice rather than revenge." "What happens next?" I asked. "We'll need to verify your evidence independently," Agent Foster explained. "We'll interview the clients you've identified, examine financial records, and potentially conduct surveillance of ongoing company activities. If our investigation confirms what you've presented today, we'll coordinate with the Department of Justice to determine whether criminal charges are appropriate." "How long does that process take?" "It depends on how cooperative the subjects of the investigation are and how complex their financial structures turn out to be. But based on what you've shown us today, I would expect some kind of resolution within 6 months." 6 months! It seemed like both an eternity and no time at all. 6 months during which I would have to continue working at Nexus Digital, pretending that nothing had changed, while federal investigators quietly built a case against my employers. The psychological strain of maintaining that facade turned out to be more difficult than I had anticipated. Every conversation with Brandon or Jessica felt like a performance. Every staff meeting where they discussed future plans and growth projections felt surreal, knowing that federal agents were simultaneously investigating the criminal activities that made those plans impossible. But maintaining access to the company also allowed me to continue gathering evidence. The investigators had asked me to document any new instances of fraudulent behavior or client deception, and unfortunately, Nexus Digital provided plenty of opportunities. In February, the company launched what they called their Authentic Influence Initiative, a new service offering that promised clients access to a network of micro-influencers who would create genuine, personal content about their products or services. The reality of the program was a systematic deception that was even more brazen than their previous fraudulent activities. The micro-influencers were actually overseas contractors who were being paid to create fake social media personas, complete with purchased followers and fabricated personal histories.
clients were paying premium prices for what they believed were authentic endorsements from real people who genuinely used and loved their products. Instead, they were getting manufactured content from people who had never seen the products they were promoting and who were using stock photography and generic testimonials to create the illusion of personal experience. The program was incredibly successful from a sales perspective. Within 2 months, Nexus Digital had signed over 20 clients to 6-figure contracts for authentic influence campaigns. The revenue boost was exactly what Brandon and Jessica needed to close their funding round with investors who were impressed by the company's innovative approach to influencer marketing. But the program was also a perfect example of wire fraud on a massive scale. Every client communication, every contract, every social media post created by the fake influencers constituted the use of electronic communications to facilitate criminal deception. I documented everything I could about the Authentic Influence Initiative, including internal emails where Jessica discussed the need to keep the overseas contractors' identities secret from clients, budget allocations for purchasing fake followers for the manufactured influencer accounts, and performance reports that deliberately obscured the artificial nature of the engagement metrics. By March, the SEC investigation had expanded to include the Department of Justice, the Federal Trade Commission, and the California Attorney General's office. Multiple agencies were now examining different aspects of Nexus Digital's operations, from securities fraud to consumer deception to employment law violations. But the company continued operating as if nothing was wrong. Brandon and Jessica announced that they had successfully closed their Series B funding round, raising $15 million from investors who believed they were supporting a rapidly growing marketing agency with innovative approaches to influencer marketing.
The disconnect between public perception and private reality was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain. Industry publications were writing glowing profiles of Nexus Digital as a disruptive force in the marketing world. Business school case studies were being written about their innovative strategies. Brandon was invited to speak at conferences about the future of authentic marketing. Meanwhile, federal investigators were building a criminal case that would demonstrate that everything the company claimed to represent was a carefully constructed lie. The breaking point came in early April when I discovered that Nexus Digital was planning to go public within the next year. They had hired an investment banking firm to begin preparing for an initial public offering that would value the company at over $200 million. An IPO based on fraudulent financial representations wasn't just securities fraud. It was securities fraud on a scale that would harm thousands of individual investors who would purchase stock based on false information about the company's performance and prospects. I called Rodriguez immediately. They can't be allowed to go public, I told him. The amount of harm they could cause to individual investors is staggering. The investigation is moving as quickly as possible, he assured me, but federal cases require thorough preparation. The investigators want to make sure they have bulletproof evidence before they move. How much more evidence do they need? We've documented systematic fraud across dozens of clients, fake influencer networks, manipulated financial reports, and now they're planning to deceive public investors. I understand your frustration, Margaret, but rushing the investigation could result in procedural errors that would allow Brandon and Jessica to escape prosecution entirely. Rodriguez was right, but his answer didn't address the urgency of the situation. Every day that Nexus Digital continued operating was another day that clients were being defrauded, employees were being scapegoated, and investors were being deceived. I decided that I needed to take additional action to accelerate the investigation timeline. If the federal agencies weren't ready to act, perhaps I could create pressure that would force their hand. I began reaching out to journalists who covered the tech industry, using contacts that Emma had provided and relationships I had built during my 25 years in marketing. I couldn't share the details of the ongoing federal investigation, but I could discuss my experiences with age discrimination and raise questions about Nexus Digital's business practices that might prompt additional scrutiny. The response was immediately enthusiastic. Several journalists had heard rumors about problems at Nexus Digital and were eager to investigate further. Within 2 weeks, I had spoken with reporters from TechCrunch, Forbes, and the San Francisco Chronicle, all of whom were working on stories that would examine the company's practices from different angles.
But I also began receiving subtle warnings that Nexus Digital was becoming aware of the increased attention. My computer access at work was further restricted, ostensibly for security reasons. I was excluded from additional meetings and projects, with Jessica explaining that my role was being streamlined to focus on strategic advisory functions. Most concerning was a conversation I overheard between Brandon and an unknown visitor in his office. They were discussing the need to manage potential reputation risks and ensure that former employees understand their ongoing obligations regarding confidential information. It was clear that they suspected someone was talking to journalists or investigators, and they were preparing to take aggressive action to protect themselves. Rodriguez advised me to be extremely careful about my personal security and to document any attempts at intimidation or retaliation. Companies facing criminal investigations often become desperate, he warned me. They may try to discredit potential witnesses through personal attacks, legal intimidation, or even more direct forms of pressure. His warning proved to be prescient. Within days of my conversations with journalists, I began receiving legal threats from a law firm representing Nexus Digital. The letters claimed that I was violating my employment agreement by discussing confidential company information with unauthorized parties and demanded that I cease all communication with media outlets immediately. The legal threats were followed by more personal forms of intimidation. I received anonymous emails suggesting that my age discrimination claims were motivated by personal bitterness rather than legitimate grievances. Someone attempted to hack into my personal email and social media accounts. A private investigator began following me and asking questions about my financial situation and family relationships. But instead of intimidating me into silence, these tactics only reinforced my conviction that exposing Nexus Digital was the right thing to do. Companies that engaged in legitimate business practices didn't need to threaten and harass whistleblowers. The situation reached a crisis point in late April when Jessica called me into her office for what she described as a career transition discussion. "Margaret, we've decided that it's time for you to move on to the next phase of your career," she said, her tone suggesting that this decision was somehow in my best interests. "We're prepared to offer you a very generous severance package that will provide financial security while you explore new opportunities." She slid a folder across her desk that contained a severance agreement identical to the one I had rejected months earlier. 6 months of salary, continued health benefits, and a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement that would prevent me from discussing anything related to my employment at Nexus Digital. "This is a limited time offer.
We need your decision by the end of the week." I looked at the agreement, knowing that signing it would provide financial security, but would also prevent me from testifying in the federal investigation or cooperating with the journalists who are working on stories about the company's practices. "I need time to review this with my attorney," I said. Jessica's expression hardened slightly. "Of course, but I want to be clear about something, Margaret. If you choose not to accept this offer, we'll have no choice but to terminate your employment for cause. Your recent performance has been concerning, and we have documentation of several instances where you failed to meet basic job requirements." It was a transparent attempt at blackmail. Sign the non-disclosure agreement and take the money, or be fired and lose any credibility as a witness in the federal investigation. That evening, I called Rodriguez to discuss my options. "They're trying to silence you before the investigation becomes public," he explained. "This is actually evidence of obstruction of justice, which is a federal crime in itself." What should I do? Don't sign anything. Document everything they've said and done to pressure you, and prepare yourself for the possibility that they'll follow through on their threats. I didn't have to wait long to find out what those threats would look like. On Friday afternoon, exactly 1 week after Jessica's ultimatum, I was called into a meeting with Brandon, Jessica, and the company's head of human resources. "Margaret, we need to discuss some serious concerns about your recent work performance and professional conduct," Brandon began, reading from a prepared statement that had obviously been written by lawyers. What followed was a litany of fabricated performance issues, each one carefully documented with dates, times, and witnesses. I had, allegedly,
missed deadlines that I had never been given, failed to complete assignments that I had never received, and behaved inappropriately in meetings that I hadn't been invited to attend. It was a masterpiece of corporate character assassination, designed to create a paper trail that would justify my termination and undermine my credibility as a whistleblower. Every allegation was technically impossible to disprove because it involved subjective judgments about work quality or interpersonal behavior. Given the severity of these performance issues, Jessica said, taking over from Brandon, we have no choice but to terminate your employment effective immediately. We're prepared to provide 2 weeks of severance pay as a gesture of goodwill, the HR representative added, but this termination is for cause, which means you won't be eligible for unemployment benefits or other standard separation benefits. I sat in that conference room, listening to them systematically destroy my professional reputation with lies and fabrications, and felt something I hadn't experienced in months: relief. They had just made the biggest mistake of their criminal enterprise. By firing me in retaliation for my cooperation with federal investigators, they had committed obstruction of justice in front of witnesses and created a paper trail that would be devastating evidence in the criminal case against them. I understand, I said calmly, gathering my personal belongings from the conference room table. I'll clean out my desk and be gone within the hour. As I walked out of Nexus Digital for the last time, carrying a cardboard box containing the few personal items I had kept at my desk, I felt like I was walking out of a prison rather than losing my job. The investigation phase was over. Now, the real battle could begin. Walking out of the Nexus Digital offices for the last time should have felt devastating. Instead, I found myself experiencing an unexpected sense of liberation as I loaded my card box of personal belongings into my car. For the first time in months, I didn't have to pretend that everything was normal. I didn't have to sit through meetings where I watched my former colleagues being set up for failure by leaders who cared more about maintaining investor confidence than delivering results for clients. The retaliation firing had been so blatantly illegal that Rodriguez was almost gleeful when I called to inform him of what had happened. They just handed us a federal obstruction of justice charge on a silver platter, he said. Firing a whistleblower who's cooperating with a federal investigation is exactly the kind of obvious criminal behavior that prosecutors love to present to juries. But Rodriguez also warned me that Nexus Digital's desperation would likely escalate now that they had moved to direct retaliation. Companies that fire whistleblowers are companies that have decided they have nothing left to lose, he explained. You need to be prepared for them to get much more aggressive in their attempts to discredit you and interfere with the investigation. His prediction proved accurate within days. The legal threats from Nexus Digital's attorneys became more frequent and more specific, claiming that my cooperation with federal investigators violated various confidentiality agreements and non-compete clauses that had supposedly been part of my employment contract. When I reviewed my actual employment documents, none of these clauses existed, but the threats were clearly designed to create the impression that my whistleblowing was somehow legally improper. More concerning were the personal attacks that began appearing on social media and industry forums. Anonymous accounts started posting detailed criticisms of my work performance at Nexus Digital, claiming that I had been terminated for incompetence and was now trying to damage the company's reputation out of spite. The posts included specific details about projects and clients that could only have come from someone with access to internal company information. The character assassination campaign was sophisticated and coordinated.
Posts appeared on LinkedIn questioning my professional judgment, on Twitter suggesting that my age discrimination claims were motivated by bitterness about being unable to keep up with industry changes, and on specialized marketing forums where anonymous users shared allegedly first-hand accounts of my supposed failures as a team leader. What made these attacks particularly insidious was that they contained just enough accurate information to seem credible, while distorting the context in ways that painted me as incompetent and vindictive. They referenced real clients and real projects, but described my role and performance in ways that were completely contrary to the documented facts. Emma was furious when she discovered the online harassment campaign. "Mom, we need to document every single one of these posts," she said during one of our daily check-in calls. "This isn't just character assassination, it's witness intimidation. And it's probably being coordinated by Nexus Digital's legal team." She was right, of course. The posts were too detailed and too coordinated to be the work of random disgruntled former colleagues. Someone with access to internal company information and significant resources was systematically trying to destroy my credibility before the federal investigation became public. But the harassment campaign had an unexpected consequence. Several former Nexus Digital employees reached out to me privately after seeing the online attacks, offering their own experiences and evidence of the company's fraudulent practices. They had been afraid to come forward on their own, but seeing me being attacked for telling the truth motivated them to add their voices to the investigation. Sarah Kim had been a junior account manager who had been fired 3 months before my termination. She had been blamed for the failure of a campaign that she had repeatedly warned her supervisors was based on unrealistic promises and inadequate resources. Her documentation showed that Jessica had overridden her professional recommendations and forced her to implement strategies that she knew would fail. "They set me up to take the fall," Sarah told me during our first phone conversation. "I have emails where I specifically outlined why the client's expectations couldn't be met with the budget and timeline they had approved. Jessica told me to stop being negative and trust the process." David Chen had been a senior content strategist who had been pushed out 6 months earlier through the same kind of performance review manipulation that had been used against me. His crime had been questioning the authenticity of the influencer partnerships that Jessica's team was selling to clients. "I discovered that half of the influencers in our network were fake accounts with purchased followers," David explained. "When I brought this to Brandon's attention, he told me I was being too rigid in my definition of authenticity. 2 weeks later, I was put on a performance improvement plan for not embracing innovative approaches to content marketing." Most valuable was testimony from Lisa Rodriguez, who had worked in Nexus Digital's accounting department before being terminated for allegedly making errors in client billing. Lisa had been responsible for processing the settlement payments that the company was making to dissatisfied clients, and she had kept detailed records of these transactions. They were paying out hundreds of thousands of dollars in settlement payments while telling investors that client satisfaction was at an all-time high, Lisa told federal investigators during her formal interview. "I was specifically instructed to categorize settlement payments as marketing expenses or client retention costs to hide them from financial audits." With testimony from former employees and evidence from defrauded clients, federal investigators had built a comprehensive case that demonstrated systematic criminal behavior across multiple areas of Nexus Digital's operations. But they still needed one final piece of evidence to ensure that prosecutions would result in convictions rather than plea bargains or settlements that would allow Brandon and Jessica to escape meaningful consequences. That evidence came from an unexpected source. Dr. Jennifer Walsh was a forensic accountant who specialized in analyzing financial records for evidence of corporate fraud. The SEC had hired her to examine Nexus Digital's books and determine the extent of their financial misrepresentations to investors. Dr. Walsh's analysis revealed that Nexus Digital's entire business model was built on a sophisticated accounting fraud scheme. The company was recognizing revenue from long-term contracts immediately upon signing, even though the services wouldn't be delivered for months or years. When clients terminated contracts early due to poor performance, the revenue recognition wasn't adjusted, creating the illusion of consistent growth even as the company was losing clients at an unsustainable rate. "This isn't just aggressive accounting," Dr. Walsh explained to investigators. "This is intentional securities fraud designed to deceive investors about the company's actual financial performance."
Her analysis showed that Nexus Digital's claimed revenue growth of 300% over 2 years was actually closer to 50% when properly accounting for contract cancellations and refunds. The company's profitability was entirely fictional, with actual operations generating significant losses that were hidden through creative categorization of expenses and manipulation of revenue recognition timing. Most damaging was Dr. Walsh's discovery that Brandon and Jessica had been paying themselves substantial bonuses based on the fraudulent financial performance metrics. They had extracted over $2 million from the company through compensation packages that were tied to revenue targets that existed only on paper. By late May, federal investigators felt confident that they had assembled an airtight case against Nexus Digital's leadership. But they faced a strategic decision about how to proceed with arrests and indictments. They could move immediately to prevent further harm to investors and clients, or they could wait to gather additional evidence about the company's planned initial public offering. The decision was made for them when investigative journalists from TechCrunch and Forbes published simultaneous exposés of Nexus Digital's practices. The articles, based on interviews with former employees and defrauded clients, painted a devastating picture of a company built on lies and sustained through intimidation and fraud. The headline in TechCrunch read, "Inside the Nexus Digital Fraud, How a Promising Startup Became a Criminal Enterprise."
The Forbes article was titled, "The $50 Million Deception: How Age Discrimination Led to the Exposure of Massive Marketing Fraud." Both articles featured extensive quotes from my interviews, along with testimony from other former employees and detailed analyses of the company's fraudulent practices. But they also included something that I hadn't expected: responses from Nexus Digital's investors and board members who claimed to be shocked by the allegations. These accusations are completely contrary to everything we were told about the company's operations, said Michael Foster, a managing partner at Venture Capital Partners, who had led Nexus Digital's Series A funding round. If these allegations are proven true, our firm will be pursuing all available legal remedies against the company's leadership. The investor reactions were revealing because they demonstrated that Brandon and Jessica's fraud had extended far beyond client deception to include systematic lying to the venture capital firms that had provided their funding. The articles were published on a Tuesday morning. By Wednesday afternoon, Nexus Digital's offices were surrounded by federal agents executing search warrants. Brandon and Jessica were arrested at their homes that same evening and charged with securities fraud, wire fraud, conspiracy to commit fraud, and obstruction of justice. The perp walk images of the two tech entrepreneurs being led away in handcuffs became iconic representations of Silicon Valley's dark side. Brandon, who had built his public persona around casual confidence and disruptive innovation, looked pale and shaken as he was escorted into the federal courthouse. Jessica, who had always projected polished professionalism, appeared to have aged years in the span of a single day. But the arrests were just the beginning of what would become a comprehensive unraveling of everything Nexus Digital claimed to represent. Within hours of the arrests becoming public, Nexus Digital's remaining clients began terminating their contracts en masse. Companies that had been proudly featuring Nexus Digital campaigns in their marketing materials were scrambling to distance themselves from the scandal. The Authentic Influence Initiative, which had been generating millions in revenue, collapsed overnight as clients discovered that their authentic partnerships were relationships with fabricated personas. The company's employees, most of whom had been unaware of the criminal behavior of their leadership, found themselves in an impossible situation. They were associated with a company that had become synonymous with fraud, but they also needed to continue working to pay their bills and support their families. Many of the junior employees who had been hired to replace experienced professionals like me were devastated to learn that their career advancement had been built on a foundation of illegal activities.
Several of them reached out to apologize for their roles in my marginalization, explaining that they had genuinely believed Brandon and Jessica's claims that the company was innovating beyond traditional marketing approaches. I thought I was part of something revolutionary, one young account manager told me during a tearful phone conversation. I never realized that our disruptive approach was actually just systematic fraud. I feel like my entire career has been built on lies. The employee reactions were heartbreaking because many of these young professionals were genuinely talented individuals who had been manipulated by leaders they trusted. They had believed they were learning cutting-edge marketing techniques when they were actually being trained to participate in criminal deception. But the most dramatic revelations came during the federal investigation of Nexus Digital's financial records. Dr. Walsh's deeper analysis revealed that the fraud was even more extensive than initially suspected. The company had been operating essentially as a Ponzi scheme, using money from new clients and investors to pay settlements to previous clients while maintaining the appearance of profitability. The accounting fraud had created a situation where Nexus Digital needed to continuously grow its client base, not to generate genuine profits, but simply to maintain enough cash flow to cover their mounting legal liabilities. The aggressive sales tactics, the impossible promises, and the systematic client deception weren't just bad business practices. They were necessary components of a criminal enterprise that would have collapsed without constant infusions of new victim money. Federal prosecutors estimated that Nexus Digital had defrauded clients of over $8 million, while simultaneously deceiving investors of an additional $15 million. The total criminal liability exceeded $23 million, not including the additional damages that would be sought in civil suits. But the investigation also revealed something that provided a measure of vindication for everything I had endured. Internal emails recovered from Brandon and Jessica's personal accounts showed that they had specifically targeted me for removal because they viewed my experience and industry relationships as a threat to their fraudulent operations. "The old guard is going to be a problem as we scale," Jessica had written in an email to Brandon 6 months before my termination. "People like Margaret have too many industry contacts and too much experience to buy into our approach. We need to transition away from anyone who might ask uncomfortable questions or have relationships with clients that bypass our control." Brandon's response was equally damaging. Agreed. The beauty of hiring younger staff is that they don't have the experience to recognize when we're cutting corners. They trust our expertise and don't question our methods. These emails were smoking gun evidence that my age discrimination claims weren't just about workplace bias. They were about a criminal conspiracy to remove employees who had the knowledge and industry connections to expose fraudulent practices. The criminal trial began 8 months after Brandon and Jessica's arrests. By that time, the Nexus Digital scandal had become a case study in corporate fraud that was being discussed in business schools and law schools across the country. Federal prosecutors had assembled a presentation that methodically demonstrated how every aspect of Nexus Digital's operations had been designed to deceive clients, employees, and investors. The evidence included recordings, emails, financial documents, and testimony from over 20 witnesses who had been directly harmed by the company's practices. My testimony lasted 3 days and covered everything from the initial signs of age discrimination to my systematic documentation of the company's fraudulent practices. Defense attorneys tried to portray me as a disgruntled employee seeking revenge for being pushed out of a job, but my comprehensive evidence made it impossible to dismiss my claims as personal grievance. The most powerful moment in my testimony came when prosecutors played the recording that Patricia Williams had made of her conversation with Jessica. Hearing Jessica's voice explaining that the company's business model was based on making promises they couldn't keep while using legal agreements to prevent recourse was devastating evidence that couldn't be explained away or dismissed.
But the trial also provided an opportunity for me to explain why I had chosen to speak out despite the personal and professional risks.
I spent 25 years building relationships with clients based on trust and delivering results that exceeded their expectations, I told the jury during direct examination. Everything that Nexus Digital was doing violated the fundamental principles that I believed defined ethical marketing. I couldn't stay silent while they defrauded people who trusted them to help grow their businesses. The defense strategy focused on arguing that Brandon and Jessica were young entrepreneurs who had made mistakes in judgment rather than criminals who had intentionally deceived clients and investors. They painted the defendants as victims of an industry culture that rewarded aggressive growth and innovative approaches, suggesting that they had simply pushed legitimate business practices too far. But this strategy collapsed under the weight of the evidence showing systematic planning and deliberate deception. The fake influencer networks, the manipulated financial reports, the coordinated client settlements, and the systematic employee intimidation couldn't be explained as mistakes in judgment or cultural misunderstandings. The jury deliberated for 6 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges. Brandon was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison and ordered to pay $8 million in restitution. Jessica received 10 years and was ordered to pay $6 million in restitution. But the criminal convictions were only one aspect of the justice that emerged from the Nexus Digital scandal. The civil lawsuits filed by defrauded clients and discriminated employees resulted in additional settlements that exceeded $30 million. More importantly, the case prompted broader changes in how venture capital firms conduct due diligence on marketing agencies and how regulatory agencies monitor financial representations by companies seeking investment. The scandal also sparked industry-wide discussions about age discrimination in tech companies and the culture of prioritizing youth and innovation over experience and ethical business practices. Several major marketing agencies implemented new policies designed to prevent the kind of systematic fraud that Nexus Digital had perpetrated, including independent audits of client satisfaction and transparency requirements for influencer partnerships. But perhaps the most significant change was cultural. The Nexus Digital case became a cautionary tale about the dangers of Silicon Valley's fake-it-till-you-make-it mentality and the importance of maintaining ethical standards even in rapidly growing industries. For me personally, the trial and its aftermath marked the beginning of an entirely new phase of my career. Instead of being blacklisted from the marketing industry as I had feared, I found myself in high demand as a consultant and speaker who could help companies avoid the kind of fraudulent practices that had destroyed Nexus Digital. Law firms specializing in employment discrimination retained me to help identify patterns of age bias in tech companies. Regulatory agencies asked me to consult on investigations of other marketing agencies with suspicious practices. Business schools invited me to lecture about ethics in digital marketing and the importance of whistleblower protections. The speaking engagements were particularly meaningful because they allowed me to address young professionals who were entering the marketing industry with idealistic hopes about innovation and disruption. I could share my experience as a cautionary tale about the importance of maintaining ethical standards, even when those standards conflicted with growth targets or investor expectations. Innovation without integrity is just sophisticated fraud, I would tell audiences of MBA students and young marketing professionals. The most disruptive thing you can do in business is to consistently tell the truth and deliver on your promises. But the most unexpected consequence of my whistleblowing was the network of relationships I developed with other individuals who had taken similar risks to expose corporate fraud and discrimination. Through support groups and advocacy organizations, I met people who had challenged illegal practices in industries ranging from pharmaceuticals to defense contracting to financial services. These relationships provided perspective on the broader patterns of corporate misconduct that extended far beyond the marketing industry. They also provided emotional support during the difficult periods when the stress of litigation and media attention became overwhelming. Dr. Lisa Chang was a pharmaceutical researcher who had exposed clinical trial fraud that endangered patient safety. Marcus Williams was a defense contractor who had revealed cost overruns and safety violations that were putting military personnel at risk. Rebecca Martinez was a financial analyst who had documented systematic discrimination against women and minorities in investment banking. Each of us had faced retaliation, legal intimidation, and character assassination for speaking out about illegal practices. But we had also experienced the satisfaction of seeing justice served and meaningful changes implemented as a result of our courage to tell the truth.
The hardest part isn't the initial decision to come forward, Dr. Chang explained during one of our support group meetings. It's maintaining your resolve during the months or years when it seems like nothing is happening and the people you're trying to hold accountable are still in positions of power. She was right. The period between my initial cooperation with federal investigators and the public revelation of the investigation had been the most difficult phase of the entire experience. Watching Brandon and Jessica continue to operate their fraud while I was marginalized and eventually fired had been emotionally devastating. But the long timeline had also been necessary to build the comprehensive case that ultimately resulted in criminal convictions and meaningful industry changes. If I had gone public immediately after discovering the fraud, Nexus Digital might have been able to spin the revelations as the complaints of a disgruntled employee rather than evidence of systematic criminal behavior. The investigation's thoroughness had also protected other witnesses and ensured that Brandon and Jessica couldn't intimidate or silence additional sources of evidence. By the time the scandal became public, federal agents had already secured testimony and documentation from so many sources that individual retaliation couldn't derail the case. 6 months after the criminal trial concluded, I received a call from Emma with news that provided a perfect capstone to the entire experience. "Mom, you're not going to believe this," she said, her voice filled with excitement. "I just got off the phone with a producer from 60 Minutes. They want to do a feature story about corporate whistleblowing in the tech industry, and they want you to be the central interview." The 60 Minutes segment, which aired 9 months later, reached an audience of over 10 million viewers and sparked renewed national discussion about age discrimination and corporate fraud.
The interview allowed me to present the complete story of my experience at Nexus Digital, while also addressing broader issues about the importance of protecting whistleblowers and maintaining ethical standards in rapidly growing industries. But the most meaningful part of the interview was the opportunity to address other older workers who might be facing similar discrimination and retaliation. "Don't let anyone convince you that your experience and judgment are outdated," I said directly to the camera during the closing segment. "The tech industry needs people who remember what ethical business practices look like and who have the courage to speak up when those practices are abandoned in favor of short-term profits." The response to the 60 Minutes interview was overwhelming. I received hundreds of emails from people who shared their own experiences with age discrimination, corporate fraud, and workplace retaliation. Many of them had been afraid to speak up about illegal practices, but seeing my story gave them the courage to contact attorneys, regulatory agencies, and journalists who could help them seek justice. Several of these individuals ultimately became whistleblowers in their own right, exposing fraudulent practices in companies across multiple industries. The ripple effects of the Nexus Digital case extended far beyond a single marketing agency to contribute to broader accountability in corporate America. Looking back on the entire experience 2 years after Brandon and Jessica's convictions, I realized that being called too old for social media had been the catalyst for the most meaningful work of my career. Instead of ending my professional life, the age discrimination had revealed my true calling as an advocate for workplace fairness and corporate accountability. The irony wasn't lost on me. The very experience and judgment that Nexus Digital's leaders had dismissed as outdated were exactly the qualities that had enabled me to recognize their fraudulent practices and build the case that ultimately brought them to justice. They had been right about one thing. I was too old to accept their lies, too experienced to be intimidated by their threats, and too committed to ethical principles to stay silent while they harmed clients and employees. And that had made all the difference. 3 years have passed since that transformative moment when I walked away from Nexus Digital with nothing but a cardboard box and my integrity intact. Today, I'm sitting in my new office overlooking San Francisco Bay, preparing for another consultation with a Fortune 500 company that wants to audit their marketing practices for potential fraud risks. The transformation has been extraordinary. What began as age discrimination became the catalyst for exposing a criminal enterprise, which in turn launched an entirely new career as a corporate ethics consultant and whistleblower advocate. The very qualities that Brandon and Jessica dismissed as outdated became my greatest professional assets.
My consulting firm, Ethical Marketing Solutions, now employs 12 people and works with companies across multiple industries to implement fraud prevention protocols and age-inclusive hiring practices. We've helped prevent millions of dollars in client losses and protected countless employees from the kind of discrimination I experienced. The speaking circuit has taken me to conferences around the world where I address audiences about the importance of maintaining ethical standards in rapidly evolving industries. Business schools use my case as required reading for courses on corporate responsibility and whistleblower protection. But the most rewarding aspect of this journey has been the letters and emails from individuals who found the courage to speak up about misconduct in their own workplaces after hearing my story. Dozens of whistleblowers have come forward in industries ranging from healthcare to technology to finance, each contributing to a broader movement toward corporate accountability. Emma often jokes that I've become more famous in my 60s than most people achieve in their entire careers. The 60 Minutes interview led to a book deal, which led to a documentary, which led to testimony before congressional committees examining age discrimination in Silicon Valley. Last month, I received the Federal Bar Association's Whistleblower of the Year award, recognizing not just my role in exposing Nexus Digital's crimes, but my ongoing advocacy for workplace fairness and corporate transparency. The awards ceremony was attended by other whistleblowers I've worked with over the years, creating a powerful reminder that individual courage can spark systemic change when people are willing to risk their personal comfort for the greater good. Brandon and Jessica remain in federal prison, serving their sentences while facing ongoing civil litigation from clients and investors. Nexus Digital's assets were liquidated to provide restitution to victims, and the company name has become synonymous with corporate fraud in business ethics textbooks. But their downfall wasn't just about punishment. It was about proving that experience, integrity, and the courage to tell uncomfortable truths are never outdated values, regardless of how rapidly industries evolve or how much younger executives dismiss the wisdom of their predecessors. The tech industry has implemented new oversight mechanisms and age discrimination protections, partly as a result of the Nexus Digital case. Venture capital firms now conduct more thorough due diligence on marketing agencies, and regulatory agencies have enhanced their monitoring of financial representations by growth stage companies. More importantly, there's been a cultural shift toward valuing diverse perspectives and cross-generational collaboration in workplaces that previously prioritized youth above experience. My personal vindication came not through revenge, but through the knowledge that my actions prevented other employees from facing similar discrimination and other clients from losing their life savings to sophisticated fraud schemes. When they called me too old for social media, they thought they were ending my career. Instead, they gave me the opportunity to discover my true purpose, holding powerful people accountable for their actions and proving that integrity never goes out of style. The Margaret that walked into that lawyer's office 3 years ago would never have imagined that age discrimination would become the foundation for the most meaningful chapter of her professional life. Sometimes the worst thing that happens to you becomes the catalyst for the best thing you never knew was possible. Today, when young professionals ask me for career advice, I tell them the same thing I told that 60 Minutes audience. Never let anyone convince you that your values are outdated or your experience is irrelevant. The world needs people who remember what ethical business practices look like and who have the courage to speak up when those practices are abandoned in favor of short-term profits.
I'd like to propose that you take Emma and Connor every Wednesday afternoon and every other weekend. No restrictions on activities, no required reports, just time for you to build the kind of relationship with them that you had before. The offer was more generous than anything I dared hope for. Jessica, that would mean the world to me. It would mean the world to them, too. And honestly, it would help me remember that parenting doesn't have to be a solo performance. Children benefit from multiple loving relationships with different approaches and perspectives. Over the next hour, we worked out the details of a new arrangement that felt sustainable and beneficial for everyone involved.
Rachel would continue as their nanny, but with much more flexibility in her methods. Jessica would continue to provide structure and educational guidance, but balanced with emotional nurturing and child-directed activities. I would have regular, substantial time with Emma and Connor to maintain our close relationship and provide them with the unconditional acceptance they needed. Most importantly, all the adults in their lives would communicate openly about what we observed regarding their needs and responses, approaching their care as a collaborative effort rather than competing philosophies. There's one more thing I need to tell you, Barbara. What's that? I called the billing company and canceled the nanny payment arrangement you'd set up. I realized that having you pay for Rachel's services while excluding you from Emma and Connor's lives was not just unfair, it was cruel. Jessica, I wasn't paying for Rachel's services to punish you. I was paying for them to ensure the children received good care. I know that now. But I also know that the best care they can receive includes having their grandmother as an active, respected part of their daily lives. As Jessica prepared to leave, she turned back with one final observation. You know, the irony of this whole situation is that in trying to give Emma and Connor the perfect childhood, I was taking away some of the things that actually make childhood wonderful. Spontaneity, creativity, unconditional love, and the freedom to just be themselves. You weren't taking those things away permanently, Jessica. You were just putting them on hold while you figured out how to balance all your responsibilities as their mother. Thank you for not giving up on them, Barbara, or on me. The following Wednesday, Emma and Connor arrived at my house carrying overnight bags and expressions of excited anticipation I hadn't seen from them in months. There were no instruction sheets, no scheduled activities, no predetermined learning objectives. "What should we do today, Grandma Barbara?" Emma asked, bouncing on her toes with energy that had been constrained for far too long. "What sounds fun to you?" Connor, who had barely spoken during the structured visits, piped up immediately. "Can we make cookies again and paint pictures and look for bugs in the garden? We can do all of those things and anything else that sounds interesting." They spent the afternoon moving freely between activities, following their curiosity and energy rather than anyone else's schedule. They helped me bake bread, creating more mess than actual assistance, but laughing constantly. They painted elaborate pictures that had no educational objectives beyond the joy of creation. They collected leaves and rocks and told me elaborate stories about imaginary creatures that lived in my garden. At dinner time, Emma looked up from her plate of spaghetti and said something that nearly brought me to tears. "Grandma Barbara, I feel happy when I'm at your house." "Why do you think that is, sweetheart?" "Because you like me, just the way I am." Just the way she was. Not the way she could become with proper guidance and structure, but exactly the way she was in that moment. Sauce on her chin, and paint under her fingernails, and stories spilling out of her faster than she could tell them. That evening, as I tucked both children into beds in the guest room I'd maintained for their visits, Connor reached up and hugged me tightly. "I love you, Grandma Barbara." "I love you too, Connor. Forever and always, no matter what. Even when I make mistakes? Especially when you make mistakes, because that's when you need love the most." After they fell asleep, I sat in my garden thinking about the journey that had brought us to this point. The financial pressure I'd applied had been effective, not because it was punitive, but because it had forced everyone to examine whether our priorities were actually serving the children's well-being. Jessica's willingness to change course when presented with clear evidence of her children's distress had ultimately saved our family relationships, and more importantly, had given Emma and Connor back the emotional freedom they needed to thrive. 6 months later, I watch Emma help Connor learn to ride a bicycle in my backyard, while Jessica sits beside me on the porch, both of us laughing at their determination and celebrating their progress. Rachel stops by occasionally to join us for dinner, having become a valued family friend rather than just an employee.
The children are confident, curious, and secure in the knowledge that they are loved unconditionally by multiple adults who communicate openly and work together to support their happiness. They follow some rules and ignore others, learn through both structured activities and creative play, and most importantly, trust that their own preferences and interests matter to the adults in their lives. Sometimes the most effective way to change a situation isn't to fight against it directly, but to make the cost of maintaining it too high to sustain. My nanny bills accomplished what months of diplomatic negotiation couldn't. They forced everyone to acknowledge the true value of what we'd been taking for granted. Love isn't always free, but it's always worth the investment. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.